The sun over the city skyline didn't shine for Julian Thorne, it performed for him. From the 42nd floor of the Vance Tower, the world looked like a sprawling circuit board, and Julian felt like the only processor that mattered. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, his reflection ghosting against the glass. He was 34, wore a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and was the CEO of Thorne Digital, the hottest disruptor in the tech logistics space. Or at least, he had been until the Nexus merger hit a wall this morning. "The board is nervous, Julian," his legal counsel had whispered over the phone an hour ago. "They think you've lost the killer instinct. They say the company has become soft." Julian loathed that word. Soft. He turned away from the window, his gaze landing on the neatly stacked folders on his mahogany desk. Every document was perfectly aligned. His coffee was exactly 165 degrees, just the way he liked it. His calendar was a masterpiece of efficiency. All of this was the work of Clara Vance. Clara. She had been his executive assistant for 2 years. She was punctual, invisible, and terrifyingly competent. But to Julian's caffeine-addled, ego-driven brain, her competence felt like a beige wall. She didn't scream. She didn't disrupt. She simply existed, making his life run so smoothly that he had forgotten how much work it took. "She's the problem," Julian muttered to the empty room. "She's the reason the board thinks I'm soft. I'm surrounded by a safety net instead of a spear." He pressed the intercom button with a sharp, aggressive motion. "Clara. My office. Now." The door opened less than 10 seconds later. Clara entered with the grace of someone who lived her life in the margins. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a professional low bun. She held a tablet in one hand and a fresh stylus in the other. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, steady alto. "I've also flagged the discrepancies in the Nexus contract. If we pivot the liability clause by—" "Sit down, Clara," Julian interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. He didn't look at her, he looked at the gold fountain pen on his desk. Clara paused, a flicker of something was it pity, crossing her eyes before she sat. She crossed her legs and waited. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating. Julian wanted her to look nervous. He wanted her to fidget. But she sat as still as a marble statue in a museum. "I've been doing some thinking," Julian began, leaning back in his Italian leather chair, which creaked under his weight. "About the DNA of this company. Thorne Digital was built on fire. It was built on risk. But lately, the air in here feels stagnant. It feels like a library." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Efficiency isn't stagnation, Julian. It's the foundation that allows you to take those risks." "Don't lecture me on my own company," Julian snapped. He stood up and began to pace the length of the room, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the polished hardwood. "You're a great organizer, Clara. Truly. You're the best secretary I've ever had. But that's just it? You're a secretary. I need a shark. I need a chief of staff who eats pressure for breakfast and asks for seconds. I need someone who matches my alpha energy." Clara's expression remained unreadable. "And you feel I don't match that energy?" Julian stopped pacing and leaned over the desk, invading her personal space. "I feel like I'm looking at a spreadsheet in a human suit. You're too safe. You're too quiet. You make everything so easy that I've become bored. And frankly, you're a relic of the old Thorne Digital. I'm rebranding. And that rebrand starts with a clean slate." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. He slid it across the mahogany surface. It collided with Clara's tablet with a dull thud. "That's your severance," Julian said, his voice dropping to a cold, practiced tone. 6 months' pay. That's more than generous for someone of your level. I want your desk cleared by noon. My security team will escort you out. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't suffocating, it was electric. Clara didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she looked at the office, the expensive art on the walls, the view of the city, the Vance Tower logo etched into the glass partition with a strange, nostalgic smile. By noon? She asked softly. That's quite a tight deadline, Julian. Are you sure you've thought this through? Transitions can be incredibly expensive. More expensive than you can afford. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. I'm a billionaire, Clara. I think I can afford to replace a girl who handles my dry cleaning. Don't try to be dramatic on your way out. It doesn't suit you. Clara stood up slowly. She didn't pick up the severance package. She didn't even pick up her tablet. She simply smoothed out the wrinkles in her skirt. You know, Julian, she said, her voice echoing in the large office. I took this job because I wanted to see if the man matched the myth. I wanted to see if Thorn Digital was a house of cards or a fortress. It turns out, you aren't even the one holding the cards. You're just the guy sitting at the table I provided. Get out, Julian hissed, the heat rising in his neck. Before I have security drag you out. Clara nodded once. I'll leave. But I'd suggest you spend your afternoon reading your lease agreement instead of the stock market. There's a specific clause on page 42 regarding moral turpitude and the ownership's right to immediate reclamation. Julian scoffed. My lawyers wrote that lease. It's ironclad. Your lawyers wrote it, Clara said, reaching the door and placing her hand on the handle. She turned back to look at him one last time, her eyes glinting with a hidden fire. But my family's lawyers approved it. Goodbye, Julian. Try not to break anything on your way out. I've always liked the floors in this building. She stepped out, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click. Julian stood alone in his glass kingdom, fuming. The ego on that woman, he muttered, grabbing his lukewarm coffee and taking a bitter gulp. He felt a strange rush of adrenaline. He felt powerful. He had cut the dead weight. He was the shark again. He walked over to his desk and dumped Clara's severance envelope into the trash can. He didn't need her. By tomorrow, he'd have a new assistant, a shark, and Thorn Digital would be back on top. He looked out at the city, feeling like the king of the world. He didn't notice that for the first time in 2 years, the light on his desk was flickering. He didn't notice that the air conditioning had hummed to a dead stop. And he certainly didn't notice the black town car waiting at the curb 42 floors below, ready to whisk the secretary away to a boardroom that Julian Thorn wasn't even allowed to enter. Julian Thorn had just fired his assistant. He just didn't realize he had also just evicted himself. If Julian Thorn's ego had been a physical object, it would have been a skyscraper shining, impenetrable, and casting a long shadow over everyone else. But as Wednesday morning dawned, that skyscraper began to show its first hairline fractures. Julian arrived at the Vance Tower at 8 a.m., expecting the usual fanfare of his existence. Usually, the lobby security would have his private elevator waiting. Usually, the scent of expensive Arabica beans would waft from his suite before he even stepped off the lift. Usually, his life was a series of doors opening before he even reached for the handle. Today, the elevator was under maintenance. What do you mean it's down? Julian barked at the security guard, a man named Gary whom Julian had ignored for 2 years. Gary didn't look up from his clipboard. Orders from the top, Mr. Thorn. Annual safety inspection for the private bank. You'll have to use the freight elevator or the stairs. Freight is around the back, past the dumpsters. Julian's face turned a shade of purple that matched his silk tie. Do you have any idea who I am? I pay more in rent for the penthouse than you make in a decade. I just follow the orders, sir, Gary said, his voice suspiciously devoid of the usual subservience. And right now, the orders say no private lifts for Thorn Digital. Gritting his teeth, Julian spent the next 10 minutes in a cramped freight elevator smelling of industrial floor wax and cardboard. By the time he reached the 42nd floor, he was sweating, and his alpha energy was simmering into a low-grade rage. He marched toward the glass double doors of Thorn Digital, ready to fire the first person who looked at him sideways. But he stopped dead in his tracks. Taped directly to the pristine glass centered with a mathematical precision that felt hauntingly familiar was a thick, cream-colored envelope. Across the front, in bold, black calligraphy, were the words, "Notice of lease termination, immediate vacate." "Is this a joke?" Julian whispered to the empty hallway. He ripped the envelope off the door. Inside was a legal document that read like a death warrant. Vance Properties LLC, the owner of the building, was exercising a right of reclamation clause. Due to a reorganization of the building's strategic direction, Thorn Digital had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. Julian burst into the office. "Where is everyone?" The office was a mess. Without Clara, the invisible gears had ground to a halt. The temp agency had sent over a top-tier replacement, a young man named Bradley who wore a suit that was too shiny and a smile that was too wide. Bradley was currently struggling with the industrial espresso machine, which was hissing and spraying steam like a dying dragon. "Mr. Thorne." "Good morning." Bradley chirped, wiping a splatter of foam from his cheek. "I couldn't find the password for the server, and the internet seems to be throttled to 1990s speeds. Also, there's a guy in the lobby saying our deliveries are being diverted to a warehouse in New Jersey." Julian didn't answer. He stormed into his private office, slammed the door, and dialed his lead counsel, Marcus Vane. "Marcus! Get the landlord on the phone." Julian screamed into the receiver. "Some idiot at Vance Properties just sent us an eviction notice. They're claiming personal use of the floor. That's illegal. We have a 5-year lease." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Julian heard the sound of papers rustling, frantic rustling. "Julian," Marcus said, his voice uncharacteristically small. "I've been looking at the digital copy of the lease you sent over this morning. Or rather, the one Clara sent to my assistant yesterday afternoon before she left. And there's an addendum, Julian. A right of first refusal and reclamation. It's a standard clause for high-end boutique leases, but yours has a specific trigger. The landlord can reclaim the space for executive personal use at any time with 30 days notice, provided they pay a small relocation fee." Julian slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk. "Who is the landlord, Marcus? I've been in this building for 2 years and I've only ever dealt with the management firm. Who owns Vance Properties LLC?" "That's the thing," Marcus replied. "It's a blind trust. Extremely private. One of the old money families in the city. But the signature on the termination notice. Julian, have you looked at the signature on the bottom of the document?" Julian pulled the paper from his pocket. He hadn't bothered to look at the bottom. He had been too busy looking at the word eviction. He looked now. The signature wasn't a scrawl. It was elegant, sharp, and perfectly legible. Clara V. Vance, CEO and Managing Partner, Vance Properties LLC. The phone slipped from Julian's hand, clattering onto the desk. The room seemed to tilt. The V in Clara Vance. He had always assumed it stood for something common: Victoria, maybe. Or Vanessa. He looked around his office. The Vance Tower. The Vance Plaza. The Vance Charitable Trust logo he saw every day on the way to work. He had spent 2 years treating the owner of the Skyline like a girl who didn't know how to order his lunch properly. "She's a secretary," Julian whispered to the walls. She's just a secretary. She took notes. She filed my taxes. She bought my mother's birthday presents. Then, a cold realization hit him. Clara hadn't just handled his life, she had handled his secrets. She knew the Thorn Digital books better than the CFO did. She knew about the creative accounting they'd used to bolster the Nexus merger. She knew about the board members who were unhappy. She knew exactly how much debt the company was carrying to keep this high-profile office. If she kicked him out now, the Nexus merger would fail. The board would see the immediate vacate notice as a sign of financial instability. The stock would plummet. Julian sat in his leather chair, the same chair he had used to fire her 24 hours ago. He felt small. For the first time in his life, the ceiling felt like it was descending. Suddenly, the intercom buzzed. It was Bradley, the temp. Mr. Thorne? There's a woman here to see you. She says she's here to collect her personal belongings. She didn't have an appointment, but she has a key. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. He stood up, adjusted his tie out of habit, and tried to summon the mask of the Alpha CEO one last time. Send her in, Julian said, his voice cracking slightly. The door opened. It wasn't the Clara he knew. The charcoal blazer was gone, replaced by a deep emerald silk dress that radiated power. She wasn't carrying a notepad, she was carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Julian's car. Behind her stood two men in dark suits, not security guards, but lawyers. High-priced, shark lawyers from the firm Julian had always wanted to hire but couldn't afford. Clara walked into the center of the room. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at the view. It really is a lovely view, isn't it? She said, her voice sounding different, richer, more confident. My grandfather built this tower. He used to say that you can tell a man's character by how he treats the people he doesn't think can fight back. Julian cleared his throat. Clara. We clearly had a misunderstanding. I was under a lot of stress yesterday. The Nexus deal. The Nexus deal is dead, Julian, Clara interrupted, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were like ice. I called the CEO of Nexus this morning. We're old family friends. I told him that Thorn Digital was experiencing some leadership instability. He thanked me for the heads up. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. You sabotaged me. No, Clara said, stepping toward the desk. I stopped protecting you. There's a difference. For 2 years, I kept your secrets, fixed your mistakes, and ensured this building's management gave you every break possible. I wanted to see if you were worth the investment. She leaned over the desk, the same way Julian had done to her the day before. You failed the test, Julian. You're not a shark. You're a remora, a small fish that attaches itself to something bigger and thinks it's the one doing the swimming. She tapped the eviction notice on his desk. You have 30 days. But if I were you, I'd start packing today. I've decided to turn this floor into a private art gallery. I think it needs more soul. And considerably less ego. She turned to leave, her lawyers following her like shadows. Wait. Julian shouted, desperation finally breaking through his pride. Clara, please. We can talk about this. I'll make you a partner. Clara stopped at the door, but she didn't turn around. I'm already your partner, Julian, she said softly. In fact, I own 60% of your debt through 3 different holding companies. I don't want a seat at your table. I'm simply taking the table back. The door closed. Julian stood in the center of the room, surrounded by his expensive art and his mahogany furniture, and realized that the secretary hadn't just left. She had taken the floor, the walls, and the very ground he stood on with her. The rain began to fall in heavy, rhythmic sheets over the city, turning the skyline into a blurred watercolor of gray and charcoal. For Julian Thorne, the weather felt like a personal insult. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, his 5 o'clock shadow had moved into its second day, and his $4 suit was wrinkled from a night spent pacing his living room. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the signature, Clara V. Vance. It haunted him like a ghost in the machine. His phone had been vibrating non-stop. The Nexa CEO had officially pulled out of the merger. 3 of his major board members had resigned via email. The trade blogs were already whispering about liquidity issues at Thorne Digital. Julian was drowning, and the only person with a life raft was the woman he had treated like a piece of office furniture for 700 days. At 10 a.m., Julian stood before the monolith that was Vance Plaza. While his own office was located in a trendy, glass-heavy lifestyle building, Vance Plaza was different. It was a fortress of black granite and stainless steel, a monument to old-world dominance. This wasn't where disruptors lived, this was where the people who owned the industries resided. Julian walked through the revolving doors, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He approached the reception desk, a slab of white marble that looked like it had been carved from a single mountain. "I'm here to see Clara Vance," Julian said, trying to steady his voice. He reached for his wallet to produce a business card, but his hand shook, and the card fluttered to the floor. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and a gaze like a laser, didn't even look at the card. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Thorne?" Julian blinked. She knows who I am. I'm Julian Thorne, CEO of Thorne Digital. She worked for me. I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Thorne, the receptionist said, her voice perfectly modulated and utterly cold. But Ms. Vance's schedule is booked through the next quarter. If you wish to discuss your lease, you should speak with the property management division on the 4th floor. This isn't about the lease. Julian snapped, his alpha mask slipping for a moment. It's personal. Tell her it's Julian. Tell her I'm here to apologize. The receptionist paused, her fingers hovering over a silent keyboard. She looked at Julian, really looked at him, seeing the desperation in his eyes and the desperation in his clothes. Something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that the power dynamic of the city had shifted overnight. "Wait in the gallery," she said finally. "If she has a gap between her briefings, I will let her know." Julian waited. He waited for 2 hours. He sat in a high-backed leather chair in a gallery filled with art that cost more than his entire company's valuation. He watched as titans of industry, men and women he had only seen on the covers of Forbes, walked past him with purpose. None of them looked at him. In this building, Julian Thorne wasn't a shark, he was a minnow in a tank of leviathans. Finally, a young man in a slim-fit suit approached him. "Mr. Thorne? Ms. Vance will see you now. Please follow me." Julian stood up too quickly, feeling a wave of vertigo. He followed the young man to a private elevator. There were no buttons. The lift scanned the young man's retina and began a silent, pressurized ascent to the very top, the 65th floor. The doors opened directly into a boardroom. It was a room designed to intimidate. A 30-foot table of dark, polished mahogany stretched across the space, reflecting the storm clouds outside. At the far end, framed by the gray sky of the city she owned, sat Clara. She wasn't alone. 5 men and women, all older, all looking like they had been carved out of the same granite as the building, sat around her. They were looking at tablets, whispering in low tones. Clara didn't look up when Julian entered. She was reading a document, a pair of elegant reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, a detail Julian had never noticed before. "The Q3 projections for the London holdings are soft," Clara said to the man on her left. "Increase the pressure on the logistics team. I want a 4% margin increase by Friday, or I want a new team." "Yes, Ms. Vance," the man said, nodding frantically. Julian stood by the door, frozen. This wasn't the woman who made him let's. This was a commander. Julian, Clara said, her voice cutting through the room without her even raising it. She finally looked up, her glasses sliding down as she peered over them. You're late. I expected you at 8:00 a.m. I had some trouble with the lobby, Julian stammered, hating how weak he sounded. Clara gestured to the empty chair at the very foot of the table, the furthest possible distance from her. Sit. We have 5 minutes before my board meeting for the Atlantic merger. Julian walked the length of the room. Every step felt like a mile. He sat down, his hands trembling under the table. Clara, he started, I know I messed up. The firing, it was a mistake. A momentary lapse in judgment. I was under immense pressure from the board, and I lashed out at the person I trusted most. Clara tilted her head. One of the men at the table let out a short, sharp snort of laughter. Clara raised a hand, and the man went silent instantly. The person you trusted most? Clara asked, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Julian, you didn't even know my middle name. You didn't know I have a degree in macroeconomics from Oxford. You didn't know that for the last 2 years, I've been rewriting your technical white papers because your visionary prose was grammatically incoherent. Julian flinched. I value your intelligence, Clara. I always did. That's why I'm here. Let's forget the eviction. Let's forget the Nexus sabotage. Come back to Thorn Digital. Not as an assistant. As a partner. 50/50ths. We can build something incredible together. Clara leaned back in her chair. The high back leather framed her like a throne. Julian, look around you, she said, gesturing to the silent, powerful people surrounding her. Do you honestly think I need 50% of a failing startup? Do you think I want to build something with a man who can't even see the person standing right in front of him? I'm a good CEO, Clara. I built Thorn Digital from nothing. You built it on a loan from my father's venture capital firm, she countered sharply. A loan that I personally approved because I thought you had potential. I took the assistant job because I wanted to see how our money was being spent. I wanted to see if the Thorn genius was real. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. And what did I find? I found a man who spends $20 a month on client entertainment while his junior developers are working 80-hour weeks without overtime. I found a man who treats his staff like disposable tissues. I found a man who is so blinded by his own reflection that he didn't realize his executive assistant was the one holding his entire life together. I can change, Julian whispered. People like you don't change, Julian. They just get more expensive, Clara said. She picked up a single sheet of paper from the table. You're not here to negotiate your lease. You're here because you realized that without me, Thorn Digital is a hollow shell. You're here to beg. Julian felt the last of his pride crumble. Please, Clara. If the lease is terminated, the board will force me out. I'll lose everything. The company is my life. Clara looked at him for a long beat. The silence in the room was absolute. The rain lashed against the windows, a dull roar that seemed to emphasize Julian's isolation. I'm not a cruel woman, Julian, Clara said, her voice dropping to a level that made the hairs on his neck stand up. But I am a businesswoman. And right now, Thorn Digital is a bad asset. However, I have a proposal. Julian's eyes lit up with a desperate hope. Anything. Name it. I don't want your partnership, Clara said. I want your resignation. Effective immediately. You will sell your remaining shares to Vance Properties for their current market value, which, thanks to your performance this morning, is at an all-time low. Julian gasped. You want me to walk away? From my own company? It hasn't been your company for a long time, Julian. You were just the face on the website, Clara said. She slid a gold pen across the mahogany table. It rolled and stopped right in front of him. Sign the intent to sell, and I will allow the lease to continue. The employees will keep their jobs. The company will survive under new management. You will walk away with enough money to retire comfortably in a small town where nobody knows your name. And if I don't? Clara's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. If you don't, I will exercise the debt call option my firm holds on your Series B funding. By 5 p.m. today, Thorn Digital will be in involuntary bankruptcy. You will be tied up in litigation for the next decade. You will lose the office, the cars, the penthouse, and your reputation. You will be the man who fired the woman who owned him. Julian looked at the pen. It was gold, heavy, and cold. He looked at Clara. She looked like a queen deciding the fate of a peasant. He realized then that she hadn't just been his assistant. She had been his warden. For 2 years, she had watched him, measured him, and waited for him to prove her wrong. And he had failed every single day. He reached for the pen. His hand was no longer shaking, it was numb. Why? He asked, his voice a mere shadow. Why did you stay for 2 years? Why play the part of a secretary if you had all this? Clara stood up, the signal that the meeting was over. Her board members stood with her, a wall of power behind her. Because, Julian, she said, walking toward the private elevator, I wanted to see if there was a heart under the suit. I wanted to give you every chance to be a leader instead of just a boss. She stepped into the elevator and turned to face him as the doors began to close. You should have looked at the coffee, Julian. I stopped putting sugar in it 6 months ago to see if you'd notice. You never did. You were too busy looking at yourself. The doors hissed shut. Julian Thorne sat alone at the end of a 30-foot table, the gold pen in his hand, in a building that reached into the clouds, realizing that he had never been the one in charge. The walk from Vance Plaza back to his office was the longest 3 blocks of Julian Thorne's life. The rain had slowed to a miserable, cold drizzle that clung to his wool coat, making it heavy and smelling of wet sheep. He didn't hail a taxi. He didn't call his driver. He simply walked, his leather sole slapping against the pavement, feeling the eyes of the city on him though, in reality, no one cared. In the city of giants, a fallen man is just another pedestrian. When he reached the doors of the Vance Tower, Gary the security guard didn't even look up. The under maintenance sign was gone from the private elevator, but when Julian swiped his executive keycard, the sensor emitted a harsh, red beep. Access denied. Julian stared at the little red light. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. 2 years of good morning, Mr. Thorne, and right this way, sir, had evaporated into a binary rejection. My card isn't working, Julian said, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. Gary leaned back in his chair, tapping a rhythm on his desk. Card's been deactivated, Mr. Thorne. New security protocols from the landlord. You're on the visitor list now. I need to see ID and issue you a temporary pass. Escorted access only. Julian's jaw tightened. I am the CEO of the anchor tenant on the 42nd floor. The paperwork says otherwise, sir, Gary replied, sliding a clip-on plastic badge across the marble counter. It was yellow, the color for temporary contractors and delivery drivers. Across the front, in thermal ink, it read, Visitor, Julian T. Status, exiting. The elevator ride up was shared with a courier and 2 junior analysts from a law firm on the 30th floor. They were complaining about their bosses, oblivious to the fact that the man standing in the corner had just lost an empire. Julian clutched his yellow badge, hiding it in the palm of his hand. When the doors opened on the 42nd floor, the atmosphere had already shifted. The frantic, caffeinated energy of Thorn Digital had been replaced by a strange, expectant silence. People weren't at their desks typing, they were huddled in small groups near the break room, whispering. The Thorn digital logo, a sleek, minimalist tee in neon blue, was already being unscrewed from the wall by two workmen in overalls. "What are you doing?" Julian shouted, his old instincts taking over. "Stop that! Who gave you permission?" The workmen didn't even pause. One of them pointed a thumb toward Julian's old office. "The owner said the branding is obsolete." Julian marched toward his office, but he stopped at the threshold. His mahogany desk, the one he had spent $15 on to project authority, was being pushed into a corner. In its place was a simple, elegant glass table. Sitting in his leather chair was a young woman Julian vaguely recognized. She was in her mid-20s, wearing a smart blazer and glasses. "Sarah?" Julian asked, frowning. "The intern from the marketing department." Sarah looked up, a calm, professional smile on her face. "Hello, Julian. Actually, it's Sarah Miller, MBA. And as of 20 minutes ago, I'm the interim chief operating officer of Vance Thorn Logistics." Vance Thorn. Julian's stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. "I only signed the papers an hour ago." "Ms. Vance is very efficient," Sarah said. She stood up and walked around the desk. She didn't look like the nervous intern who used to stumble over her words in meetings. She looked like she had been waiting for this moment since the day she was hired. "I've been working as her internal scout for 6 months. She knew you were bleeding talent and morale. She's been preparing the restructuring plan while you were busy picking out the color for your next Tesla." Sarah handed Julian a cardboard box. A plain, brown, humiliating cardboard box. "You have 1 hour to collect your personal items, Julian. Everything else, the furniture, the computers, the intellectual property, now belongs to Vance Properties. Please try to be discreet. The staff is, well, they're relieved, and we'd like to keep the transition positive." Julian took the box. The weight of it felt like a mountain. He walked into his office, his former office, and began to scrape his life into the cardboard. The gold-plated stapler. The framed photo of himself at the tech summit. He realized, with a pang of shame, that he didn't have any photos of family or friends. The expensive whiskey decanter, now half empty. As he reached for a small, hand-carved wooden bird on the bookshelf, a gift from a developer whose child he had helped get into a specialist clinic, the only truly kind thing he'd done in years, a shadow fell across the doorway. Clara was there. She wasn't wearing the power suit anymore. She had changed into a simple, high-quality cashmere sweater and trousers. She looked comfortable. She looked like she owned the air she breathed. "You missed a spot," she said softly, pointing to a small silver pen that had rolled under the radiator. "That was a gift from your father when you passed the bar, wasn't it? You shouldn't leave that behind." Julian knelt down, his knees popping, and fished the pen out from the dust. He stood up, clutching it, and looked at her. "You're really doing this," he said. "You're putting an intern in charge of my life's work." "Sarah isn't just an intern, Julian. She's a genius who was being stifled by your ego," Clara replied, leaning against the doorframe. "And it's not your life's work anymore. It's a recovery project. I'm going to prove that this company can be profitable without being predatory." Julian looked around the room. "What happens to me now, Clara? You've taken the building. You've taken the company. You've taken my name off the door." Clara walked into the room, stopping just inches from him. The scent of her perfume, something subtle, like sandalwood and rain, filled his senses. "What happens next is up to you, Julian. For the first time in your life, you don't have a title to hide behind. You don't have a secretary to fix your mistakes. You're just a man with a checkbook and a lot of free time." She reached out and adjusted the yellow visitor badge on his lapel, straightening it with a gentle, almost mocking care. I've arranged for a junior consultant position, she said. Not here. In our satellite office in the suburbs. It's a small, windowless room where you'll be doing data entry for Sarah's team. It pays $45 a year. Julian laughed, a dry, bitter sound. You're joking. You want me to be a clerk? I want you to learn what it feels like to be the beige wall, Julian, Clara said, her voice turning cold again. I want you to see the world from the bottom of the circuit board. If you do well, in 5 years, maybe you'll earn a window. If you don't? Well, you have your severance. It's 6 months' pay. I believe you said that was more than generous for someone of your level. Julian looked at the cardboard box. Then he looked at the glass table where Sarah was already opening a laptop and beginning the work of rebuilding his dream. He realized then that the reality check wasn't about the money. He still had a few million in the bank from the sale. He wasn't going to starve. The reality check was the realization that the world didn't stop turning when he stepped off the pedestal. The office was already louder, brighter, and more energetic without him. He picked up the box. I won't take the job, Julian said, trying to salvage one last shred of dignity. I didn't think you would, Clara said, stepping aside to let him pass. Pride is a very expensive habit, Julian. I hope you can afford it. As Julian walked toward the elevator, his box of trinkets feeling heavier with every step, he passed the desk where Clara used to sit. A new assistant was already there, a young man who looked sharp and eager. Julian stopped for a second. Hey, he whispered to the new guy. The young man looked up. Yes, sir. I mean, yes. The coffee, Julian said, his voice cracking. The temperature, make sure it's 165 degrees. She likes it precise. The young man blinked. Actually, Ms. Vance told me she prefers tea. She said she only drank the coffee because it was easier than explaining to the previous guy that he was wrong about everything. Julian didn't say another word. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closed, and the previous guy descended into the street, leaving the Vance Tower behind. The shark was gone. The ocean, however, was doing just fine. 6 months is a long time in the tech world, but it is an eternity in the soul of a man who has lost everything he used to define himself. Julian Thorne sat in a cramped, humid co-working space in a part of the city he used to call the Sticks. There was no mahogany desk here. There was no floor-to-ceiling glass view of the skyline. Instead, he had a wobbly IKEA table, a laptop with a cracked screen, and a lukewarm cup of coffee he had brewed himself in a communal kitchen that always smelled faintly of burnt toast and despair. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. After the debt calls and the liquidation of his personal assets to avoid a decade of litigation, Julian was what the banks called comfortably middle class. He had enough to live, but not enough to be insulated from the world. For the first time in a decade, Julian was doing his own data entry. He was writing his own code. He was answering his own emails. And, most importantly, he was listening. He looked at the invitation on his screen. It was a digital card, elegant and understated, featuring the new logo of Vance Thorne Global. You are cordially invited to the relaunch gala and the opening of the Vance Gallery. Hosted by Clara V. Vance and Sarah Miller. Julian hesitated. His first instinct was to delete it. Why go back? Why watch the woman who dismantled his ego celebrate her victory? But as he looked at his reflection in the dark screen of his laptop, he saw a man who no longer looked like a shark. He looked like a human being. He decided to go. Not to beg, and not to fight, but to see the after of the before. The Vance Tower looked different under the soft glow of the evening lights. The aggressive neon blue of the old Thorne digital logo had been replaced by a warm, backlit bronze. Julian approached the desk. Gary was there, as always. Good evening, Gary, Julian said. He didn't bark it. He didn't look over the man's head. He looked him in the eye. Gary paused, his hand hovering over the visitor logs. He looked at Julian, at the slightly weathered suit, the lack of a $50 watch, and the calm expression. "Mr. Thorne. You're on the VIP list tonight. No yellow badge for you." "Thanks, Gary," Julian said with a small, genuine smile. "How's your son doing? I remember you mentioned he was applying for that engineering scholarship." Gary froze. He had mentioned that once, 18 months ago, while Julian was waiting for an Uber. Julian had ignored him then. He got it, sir. Started last month." "Glad to hear it," Julian said, tapping the marble counter once before heading to the elevator. The 42nd floor was unrecognizable. The walls that once divided the executives from the workers had been torn down. The space was open, filled with natural light and actual greenery. There was a library, a quiet zone, and a central hub where people were laughing and talking, not out of caffeine-fueled anxiety, but out of genuine collaboration. He saw Sarah Miller in the center of the room. She was wearing a bold, red suit, holding a glass of champagne, and commanding the room with an authority that wasn't built on fear. When she saw Julian, she didn't sneer. She walked over and offered her hand. "You came," she said, sounding impressed. "I wanted to see what a healthy company looked like," Julian admitted, shaking her hand. "The numbers coming out of Vance Thorne are, well, they're 20% higher than my best quarter." "How?" "It's simple, Julian," Sarah said, gesturing to the room. "I stopped managing by metrics and started managing by people. We kept your core tech, but we threw out your shark culture. It turns out, when people aren't afraid of being fired for having a human error, they actually work harder to fix those errors." "And Clara?" Julian asked. "In the gallery," Sarah pointed toward the back, where the private offices used to be. "She's waiting for you." The Vance Gallery was a sanctuary of silence amidst the party. The walls were hung with modern art pieces that were challenging, beautiful, and expensive. Clara stood at the far end, looking out the window at the city she owned. She didn't turn around when he entered. "The 165-degree coffee was a lie, Julian," she said softly. "I never liked it that hot. I just wanted to see if you'd ever ask why I was wincing when I took the first sip." Julian walked up to stand a respectful distance behind her. "I wouldn't have asked. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have even noticed you were in the room." Clara turned around. She looked radiant, but there was a softness in her eyes that Julian had never seen when she was his assistant. "You look different, Julian," she said. "I'm a junior consultant for a nonprofit now," Julian said, sticking his hands in his pockets. "I spend most of my day helping small businesses in the outer boroughs set up their logistics chains. I don't have a corner office. I have a desk next to a guy who plays the ukulele at lunch." Clara smiled. And I'm better at it than I was at being a CEO," Julian confessed. "Because I actually have to talk to the people I'm helping. I realized that for 2 years, I treated you like a piece of the architecture because I was terrified that if I looked too closely at anyone, I'd realize I wasn't the smartest person in the room." Clara nodded slowly. She walked over to a small pedestal in the center of the gallery. On it sat a single item under a glass case. It wasn't a painting or a sculpture. It was the gold fountain pen Julian had used to fire her. "Why do you have that?" Julian asked, stunned. "Because it's a reminder," Clara said. "To me, it's a reminder of the day I took back my name. To you, it should be a reminder of the price of hubris. My grandfather didn't build this tower to house egos, Julian. He built it to house dreams. You forgot the difference." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver key. She held it out to him. "What's this?" The key to the penthouse suite in the North Tower, Clara said. It's currently vacant. I'm not giving you your company back, Julian. And I'm not giving you your money back. But I'm offering you a seat on the board of the Vance Foundation. We need someone who understands exactly how a company can fail from the top down. We need a reformed shark to help us vet new investments. Julian looked at the key, then at the woman who had once been his lowly assistant. He realized that this was the final test. She wasn't offering him a shortcut back to his old life. She was offering him a chance to be part of hers on her terms. I can't take the penthouse, Julian said, his voice steady. Clara's eyebrows shot up. No. I like my apartment in the sticks, Julian said. It's quiet. And the guy with the ukulele is actually teaching me a few chords. But I'll take the board seat. I'd like to be on the side of the table that builds things for a change. Clara looked at him for a long, searching moment. Then, for the first time in the 3 years they had known each other, she reached out and patted his shoulder not as a subordinate, and not as a landlord, but as a peer. Good choice, Julian, she said. Now, go get a drink. And for heaven's sake, don't tell the bartender how to pour it. He's been doing it longer than you've been a billionaire. Julian walked back into the main hall. He grabbed a drink, and as he stood among the people he used to ignore, he realized that the view from the 42nd floor was indeed beautiful. But it was more beautiful when you weren't looking at it as a kingdom, but as a community. He saw Clara across the room, talking to Sarah. They were the new face of the city. Calm, calculated, and deeply, effectively human. Julian Thorne had fired his assistant, only to find out she owned the building. But in losing the building, he had finally found a place where he belonged. He took a sip of his drink. It was cold, refreshing, and exactly what he needed. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look for a shark in the water. He just watched the sun set over the Vance Tower, knowing that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the cards, and that was exactly why he was finally winning.